3.
I call Andrew Williams.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to stand here on behalf of New Zealand First to discuss the Building Amendment Bill number 3. New Zealand First does not support this bill for a great many reasons. I'm on the Local Government and Environment Committee, but I was not on the committee when these recommendations were made from last year's committee, and I certainly am somewhat aghast at some of the recommendations contained in this. As one of the very few people who have been involved in local government in this chamber, and certainly very few, and as one of the very few, and certainly one of the very few on the current Local Government and Environment Committee, can I bring to this chamber some of the experiences that I know of in relation to this? And in introducing this, I would refer to John Scarry, structural engineer, who Raymond Ho referred to, and a comment he made recently in Christchurch where he referred to depraved indifference. And this very much is a bill that reflects on depraved indifference from this national government. In fact, it's a back to the future bill, in my opinion, Mr. Speaker. It's a Brideshead revisited bill. It's going back to the 1990s. It's almost a Maurice Williamson, the minister, reverting back to his time in the 1990s when they destroyed the building code, when they ripped the building code apart, when they changed the Brand's building research rules and the building code and allowed air-dried timber in this country to be used after pressure from some of the corporates, their mates in the building industry. They allowed monolithic cladding from Australia to be applied here in New Zealand in a climate where we have a lot of rain, unlike Australia, and where we have the likes of Waitemata clay and moving soils quite different to the conditions in Australia. That, combined with the air-dried timber and the monolithic cladding and the movement of the houses, ended up in our leaky house problem. I can recall 18 months ago when the Minister, Maurice Williamson, slammed the phone down on myself and 5 other mayors on a phone call when we were discussing the leaky home situation. At the time, the Minister was offering a 10% offer on the table for a full and final settlement from the government to solve the leaky homes issue. I said that was an insult. I said the government was an insult to New Zealanders who have been left in the lurch with their leaky homes to offer 10%. The Minister said, take it or leave it, that's all you're getting. If you don't take it, the government will walk away from this. We, the North Shore City Council at the time, commissioned a COVEC report, and the COVEC report by independent financial analysts showed that the $11 billion plus rebuild of leaky homes in New Zealand was going to return the government in excess, or at least 25% in taxes in the way of GST, PAYE and other company taxes. The government essentially was going to get its $2 or $3 billion back in taxes from the rebuilding exercise of over $11 billion in New Zealand home. It was interesting, as a result of giving that report to the Minister at the time, within 30 days the government turned around and offered 25% on the table, and suddenly the deal went from 10% to 25%. It proved then, Mr. Speaker, and it proved that the government really didn't know what it was doing with leaky homes, and it really didn't understand what it had created back in the 90s, with deregulation and the lowering of standards, and here we are seeing it all over again in this bill. Mr. Speaker, do we really want to see a situation where $100 shelf companies, window companies, can be responsible again for what's going on in our building industry? Do we want to see our homes revert to being built with builders' bogs, sealants and jerry building standards and self-policing of such standards by constructors and consumers alike? We do not want to see that. The only way we can stop this is to ensure that the local authorities, the local regulators and the local people with responsibility have a good input into how our homes and our buildings in this country are built. Mr. Speaker, I was recently at a major college on the North Shore, and I was aghast to find also that it has something like between $20 million and $30 million of rebuilding of buildings to fix their leaky school buildings problem. My understanding is that that is just one of something like 500 colleges in New Zealand that is going to have to go through the same exercise. We heard from the Prime Minister just recently that they're planning to sell $5 to $7 billion of assets, state assets, to help upgrade our schools and bring them into the 21st century. I put it to you, Mr Speaker, that perhaps they're having to sell the $5 to $7 billion in assets, in actual fact, to get money in to fix the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of leaky school buildings throughout this country. I think we might be getting sold down the river on this particular one, and I'd be very interested to see, again, as we're looking back 20 years now, back to the 1991-1992 period when this happened 20 years ago. It'll be very interesting in the end of this decade to look back and say, what happened to our schools? Did they get all that money reinvested in them for supposedly improvements, or was it just to fix the national government's leaky building problem? Mr Speaker, this bill shifts responsibility and accountability away from the authorities, and it puts it back on the builders and consumers. It puts it back on those $100 window companies. This is an all-care, no responsibility approach by this national government. Have we not learnt, Mr Speaker, have we not learnt from the Leaky Homes saga, which was a national disaster in the 1990s, and where they are about to create another national disaster in this decade? Also, Mr Speaker, and I particularly am concerned about this, having watched the Royal Commission in Christchurch and hearing about some of the problems there with the building standards in Christchurch, and perhaps some of the questionable designs and building methods used in Christchurch that have resulted in some of the major failures of those buildings. Mr Speaker, do we want to have a situation where our building industry is self-regulated to the point where they can put up structures, where they can put up buildings and supposedly be self-policing and self-complying? Do we want that situation, and then in years to come, because we are in an earthquake zone, because we are in a zone of movement of this land in this country, where we look back again, like the leaky home situation, like the leaky school building situation, do we want to look back and say, how on earth did we let that national government allow this sort of thing to go through and allow the lowering of standards of our building code and of our building of our premises and corporates and our housing and our schools and every other structure in this country? Mr Speaker, New Zealand First does not support this bill. We believe this bill is just another case of the national government pandering to some of its corporate mates and to assist the building industry and some of it, as they did in the 90s, with the air-dried timber, as they did in the 90s with the monolithic cladding. The minister's smiling, but the minister was there in the 1990s when they allowed it to happen. Mr Speaker, this is Brideshead Revisited. This is Back to the Future. This is bringing back the 90s all over again. And Mr Speaker, this Parliament should be ashamed of it if it puts this bill through in this form, because we all will be individually held account in years to come if we go back to a situation of having inferior building standards, inferior housing, inferior schools, inferior commercial buildings, all as a result of this building minister and this government allowing the building standards to once again be lowered. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The question is that the amendments recommended. David Clark.
Cool.